Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the Learning with FASD podcast. Learning with FASD is funded by the Australian Government Department of Health and Aged Care, and we provide an online portal that houses evidence-based resources to help educators understand and to support children and adolescents with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. I'm Associate Professor Louise Newton. I'm Program Lead in Lifespan and Brain Health Research at the Matilda Centre at the University of Sydney, and I'm the Academic Lead of Learning with FASD. And today we are very excited to be joined by Christine Brooks from the National Organisation for Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders, or NOFASD Australia. In this episode, we discuss common behavioural difficulties or key issues faced by adolescents with FASD, and we explore some effective approaches to managing challenging behaviour in a secondary school setting. So, Christine, you are the Vice Chair of the Board at NOFASD, a former primary school teacher and a foster carer to a young person with FASD. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be interested in FASD?
Well, that's right, Louise. Yes, I have been a teacher for many years, and during that period I became involved with a family, and a little girl came into our lives who we knew had had early childhood trauma. So we were quite concerned about how she'd be with her challenging behaviour, assuming that it was connected to that. And as she stayed and lived with us, and I helped, as being a primary school teacher, teach her things, I could see she was quite bright and she wanted to learn how to tell the time. And I sat with her one night and she picked it up very quickly. The next morning when I asked her to tell me the time, it was 7 o'clock, she had no idea at all. And so at school that day, I was talking to a colleague about the problem, and she said, could it be FASD? And, as a primary school teacher, I should have known, and this is why it's now my aim in life to educate educators, because I had not even considered it. And yet I knew she'd had a background of prenatal alcohol exposure. And so that's when my interest in FASD started developing. And as it turned out, yes, she did have FASD and also early childhood trauma, which is not unusual. And so many of the symptoms, if you like, overlap. And it became not only supporting me as a teacher and as a carer of this little one, but also I became just fascinated with the whole FASD and the probably the sadness about how prominent it is in our lives and yet so unrecognised. And here I am as Vice Chair of NOFASD Australia. So that's a little bit about my background and how I ended up where I am.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Christine. Unfortunately, we don't have national prevalence data on FASD in Australia, although it is estimated that FASD affects 2 to 5% of the general population. So with these figures in mind, it's likely that there will be children and adolescents with FASD in every school in Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about the estimated prevalence and difficulties with diagnosis or misdiagnosis?
Yes, you're right, Louise. The 2 to 5% is fairly conservative. And we like to say that wherever there is alcohol, there is FASD. And with a drinking culture like we have in Australia, of course, FASD is widespread, unrecognised and undiagnosed. Now, there are some higher risk areas in Australia. Some of the remote and some of the Indigenous communities have a higher prevalence. But we know that it is everywhere. And it is important, and I want to make this very clear, that FASD is not just an issue for Indigenous communities. It affects people from all backgrounds and all income levels. And we do like to say there's probably a child in every classroom in Australia with FASD. So it's underdiagnosed, underreported in many parts of Australia. And it lacks specialist diagnostic services, which means, cases go unrecognised. A lack of education means that many schools, many health sectors don't report it, don't even understand it. And also the stigma around maternal alcohol use, which prevents families from seeking help. I know I've been working up in the Northern Territory, and many of the families up there are fearful of having their children diagnosed with FASD because they will be considered poor parents, and we know that's just not the case at all. So we need far more education to help understand FASD in our country. I'll give you some figures just because they're interesting and it makes you realise why it is so prevalent. So 5 out of 10 pregnancies are unplanned. Now, we know that there's a strong association between binge drinking and unplanned pregnancies, but that's half of the pregnancies in Australia. We also know that 47% of women consume alcohol before they know they're pregnant. And a lot of our helpline calls are from young women they're not alcohol dependent by any means, social drinkers, but they've had a run of parties or been out on cruises or had a couple of special occasions. They've had drunk fairly heavily over a period of maybe only a month or two, and then they found out they're pregnant. And of course, there's great concern around that because already the baby's developing and alcohol has been consumed. So that's something to be concerned about and aware of as well. 59% of women drank alcohol at some point during their pregnancy in Australia. So that's well more than half. And also that 1 in 4 people are not aware that alcohol should be avoided during pregnancy. And that's where our education and our work in our organisation is so important. We need to make sure people understand that no alcohol during pregnancy is the safest option. So there's stigma around FASD will only diminish with education, and we need to build understanding as a whole society. This is not just the woman's concern, this is a whole society. Everybody needs to support the woman and help her through this stage. And we always say in our organisation, no blame, no shame. This is about support, not blame. So we need to make sure that professionals are educated and understand. A diagnosis is not a long waiting list, but it becomes a really easy to access service. FASD is so often misdiagnosed, and that causes a lot of problems. So 68% of those with FASD will also have ADHD. Now, many children are diagnosed with ADHD. They're not looking at the underlying problem, which is probably FASD. It's also often misdiagnosed as autism. So again, education needs to be encouraged everywhere so that we understand that often FASD is the core problem and these other things are misdiagnosed or also comorbid along with that. So quite a lot of work to be done in this area.
Yes, I agree, Christine. And thank you so much for providing those figures. They're quite staggering, really.
They are, yes. They give you a bit of a shock when you realise.
They do.
Yes.
So adolescents with FASD will all have different strengths and challenges. What are some of the common difficulties for adolescents with FASD that will emerge specifically in the school environment?
Look, this is really interesting and hard for people to get their head around because there's so many and varied. Probably there are over 400 characteristics or symptoms, if you like. So keep in mind that each young person with FASD have their own unique set of symptoms or characteristics. So each person with FASD really is unique. Now, there are certainly some common characteristics that we see across the sort of main sort of people with FASD, but in my girl's case, she's the eldest of 6. I would say they all have FASD, not all diagnosed. Each one presents differently, quite differently. So unlike many other disorders, you can't just tick boxes and say, definitely this is FASD, and it's quite difficult to diagnose because of that. It must be remembered that FASD is a spectrum, like many other brain-based disorders. So we have a range of problems that can be severe or mild, and also it mustn't be not diagnosed because the child is struggling and yet they're not severe symptoms, if that makes sense. Perhaps the most common and one of the biggest challenges is age dysmaturity, and that's the gap between a person's chronological age and their emotional, social and cognitive maturity. This means that even though the person is a certain age, they may function or behave in ways typical of a much younger individual. I'll give you an example. Our girl's 19 now. She said to me not long ago, now she looks like a 19-year-old. She acts in many ways like a 19-year-old. She loves the music. She loves the clothes, all of the rest of it. But she'll say to me quite seriously, I'm thinking of inventing a flying car. Then I'll be able to get back to Melbourne really quickly. Things like that. And you realise that probably emotionally, socially, that mind is around 10 years of age. And it's hard when you see a person with no physical appearance of having something wrong, and yet their mind is operating nearly half their age. And this causes a lot of problems with schools, a lot of problems with social interactions, and with teachers really understanding that some of the things that are happening around that child every day they're just not able to cope with because they're not there emotionally in their age. Another difficult challenge is poor executive functioning skills. So that's organisation, planning, time management, attention, focus, impulse control is a massive one. So this is where you have the children looking at students appearing as though they're not following instructions. They're not bringing the right books to lessons. They're not remembering to put their things away. They're not getting to lessons on time. They're not able to follow instructions. The memories are very poor often, and you can't just say something and assume that they will know and remember. The next day is a long way away for them and it'll be forgotten. I know when our little one, when she was quite young, I would ask her to go and brush her teeth. And she couldn't get from the kitchen to the bathroom because she'll have sort of forgotten on the way and end up under the bed. So the only way to overcome it was for me to walk with her and brush my teeth beside her. A simple solution, but yelling at her or getting cross or telling her I've already told you 3 times just doesn't work. And we have to realise that these children are not doing this on purpose. So comprehension, sensory processing, memory, many, many more areas that are really challenging for someone living with FASD. Things we can't see, things that they try and mask because they are embarrassed about some of their behaviour that they know they perhaps should be able to do. Time and money management is a massive issue too at this age. So it becomes a really challenging life. But we mustn't forget there's always strengths too. And these kids are often the kids that have got the great personalities. They're lots of fun. They're often excellent in areas of sport or music or art. And they're always very friendly and kind-natured sort of personalities and care a lot about younger children and older people. My girl just loves being with my grandchildren and she spends so much time and patience with it. It's a real joy. So always we must focus on those strengths. Never forget them.
Thank you for sharing some of those challenges and strengths as well, Christine. So the research in this area says that parents and teachers find that some of the most difficult behavioural issues for adolescents with FASD include things like rule-breaking behaviour and aggressive behaviour. In your experience, what are some of the more common behavioural difficulties that teachers may encounter with students with FASD?
This is an area, look, as a teacher, and I reflect back on my teaching days often and wish I knew as much as I know now, particularly about FASD, that I think so much of behaviour is misunderstood. And I think we must always think what it must be like for the student. You know, if you had a poor memory, you were slow at processing, you lack those executive functioning skills, maybe you have a hearing or a speech deficit, it's going to make life really hard. These are the kids that are always getting into trouble because they just can't keep up with everybody. And then their frustration builds up. They have no ability to regulate their behaviour. That's another very common problem. And they can't control it and they have massive outbursts and meltdowns. And what happens? They're punished for this. Should you punish a child with a brain-based disorder? I don't think so. And I think that as teachers, we become overworked and exhausted, all the rest of it, and the child's not doing as we expect or we ask, and consequently everything falls in a heap and the child is punished. The child has a meltdown. So these particular types of behaviours, also tiredness, I think that was one of perhaps our biggest issues with our girl. She was always tired. I don't think there was a day at school she didn't fall asleep. And I loved the teacher that put the couch in the classroom for her so that in the afternoon she could lie on the couch and have a sleep. They understood what was going on. Other people told me she was lazy, she didn't try hard enough, she was always lying on a desk. Her mind, trying to keep up with everything else, was working twice as hard. She was exhausted. She had trouble getting to sleep, she had trouble waking up. Sleep can be a big problem for these kids with FASD. So we need to think about how we are looking at their behaviour and what we're doing to support them, and that these behaviours are not something that they can control. So that's my word to teachers. Have a look, very good close look at what it is that's causing the behaviour and see if you can change it.
So we have heard repeatedly from parents, caregivers and advocates that often schools might address these challenges with things like school exclusions, so suspensions, for example. However, the evidence is clear that traditional methods of education and of discipline are not effective for young people with FASD. Why do you think this is a case, and what impact do these methods have for students with FASD?
Well, we know that students with FASD, consequences don't work. So threatening a suspension actually means nothing to them. They actually forget what it is. You've got to think you're dealing with somebody that's half their age. So if you've got a 16-year-old, you're probably dealing with the mind of an 8-year-old, and they're not fully aware of what's going to happen, and they don't often know what they've done wrong because they're doing the best they can do, and yet they're being punished for it. So suspensions are certainly not my way to go, but if the child is just not coping, and this happened regularly with our girl, and can I just say, she got through to the end of year 12, finished year 12, because she was supported so carefully. She was scaffolded right along, and both the school and us worked with her to get her through, and often she would need a wellbeing break. And she was at a school boarding, so she came from somewhere else and had to board at the school, which wasn't that far away from us. And she was able to come and spend a few days with us when things became too much, and they never called it suspension. She would not be coping at school, her behaviour would be deteriorating, and they would give us a ring and say, can she have a wellbeing break? She would come to us, we would give her her favourite food, nice hot bubble baths, lots of swings out on the decking, and calm her down and get her to re-regulate her behaviour, if you like. And then after a few days, she was calm again, and we would talk about school and she'd be ready to go back. It was never, ever said that she was being punished. The school never said it was punishment. They would say, I think it's time for you to have a break. And those are the things that work well. And we ended up having quite a few kids come and stay with us, just having a little bit of a wellbeing break from school. Not punishment. It wasn't their fault they weren't coping. Things were far too overwhelming. And so these are the things we were putting into place. When we think about a child in a wheelchair, a school will go out of their way to build ramps to support a child in a wheelchair, special bathrooms. But these kids have got a disability and very little is being done. And when they don't cope, they're being punished. So let's turn it around and see how we can help them rather than punish them. So that's how we handled those situations, and it got her through, and she loved school.
Thank you so much, Christine, for talking about those sort of alternative approaches to school exclusions. Based on your experience as a teacher and a foster carer to a young person with FASD, what are alternative solutions that are more effective to support young people with FASD that might be displaying some challenging behaviours in the school environment?
Well, I think we were particularly lucky. It was a small school, and the school were open to me coming and educating the staff about FASD. So it didn't begin off well. And once I was allowed to come in and talk to the staff and explain what FASD is and how she was working and not coping, they changed. They really made a great effort. So our girl used to always wear a red beanie. It was her security blanket. And you'll see the kids in the shopping centres with their hoodies up. You know, this is a part of their little security, so a sensory need. The school didn't want her with her school uniform to wear a bright red beanie, and instead of saying you can't wear a beanie, they introduced beanies to the whole school with the school badge on it. And it was just such a great solution. It was wonderful in winter to see all the kids with their beanies on. She didn't stand out because she had a beanie on. She was happy, and I'm sure it helped a lot of the other children. So I really thought that was a great move of the school. The other thing with dysmaturity is a lot of these kids struggle with inappropriate sexual behaviour, and because they are perhaps operating at a 10 or 12-year-old, and yet their bodies are 16, 17-year-olds, things always seem to become very inappropriate, and there's a lot of issues, and there's a lot of we get a lot of calls about this sort of behaviour. And so the school was very clever, and they gave her own room, her own bathroom, separated her from the other kids, took her out of the little shared rooms, things like that. They changed the environment so that she could manage her issues better. They were very aware. They kept in contact with us at all times. I would fill them in if there was any particular things happening in her head that I knew might affect her at school. Because of that open interaction and the willingness for them to change, so many issues they vanished. She became really happy at school. We still had our little breaks every now and again when they were needed, but there was a real shift in the way they were managing it. So they were not blaming the students, they were solving the problems and supporting them. And I think if all schools could go with that philosophy, and maybe you can't suddenly change the school uniform, but you can say, okay, that child needs to wear a hat, maybe they can wear it half of the day, or, compromise. So instead of just making the rules absolutely unbendable. See how you can approach the whole issue to suit both the child and the school and make life far more easier for everybody.
That's great, Christine. Thank you for sharing some of the different ways that teachers and schools might be able to navigate some of these really quite tricky behaviours. So one of the key messages that NOFASD delivers is that it is important to understand that challenging behaviours are a symptom of underlying brain damage and not bad behaviour that must be controlled. Can you expand on this a little bit more?
I'm so glad you brought this up because this is my real thing. You know, I say, well, we also think it's not because they won't, it's because they can't. I used to use the example of saying, you know, grow taller. I've told you 3 times, grow taller. Why aren't you growing taller? Well, of course, we'd all like to grow taller if we could, but we can't. And that's often what you're expecting from some of these kids with FASD. They just cannot do some of the things that are asked of them. And again, what happens? Instead of being supported, they often get into trouble. They can't remember many things. You can't expect them to have remembered to take that book home. You need to make sure that you write it down and give them the note to one of their carers, that sort of thing. All these little tiny little things need to be changed to support the child. And think of them again, they've got a disability. You can't see it. It's a hidden disability, but it's very, very, very much there in their lives. So all behaviour is functional. If a child is not coping and they're reacting, there's a reason why. That goes with all children. All behaviour is functional. If a child comes home and they're grizzly, it's they're tired or they're hungry or they're coming down with a cold. So there's reasons why behaviour changes, and we need to look at that. And we need to look at the child, not the behaviour. Remember, there's a child underneath here trying to cope all the time. And yes, they might be swearing, and one of our girls was throwing rocks at the teacher and was about to be actually expelled from the school. And we went out to the school and picked her up, and she was standing there screaming abuse at the teacher, and we just said, hop in the car, and she climbed in, took her home, and instead of getting cross with her, we nurtured her and, you know, we gave her her favourite food and all the things that we do to help these kids through these rough times. And after 3 days, she was so settled and happy and ready to go back that the school took her back. And yet her behaviour was totally unacceptable. And normally she would have been punished. But she was only reacting to something that she wasn't coping with. It was her anxiety was absolutely through the roof. So we mustn't solely judge them based on their outward behaviour. Remember, there's a little person inside that needs to be nurtured. We need to encourage a more empathetic and supportive approach to dealing with challenging behaviours. Just generally, all children, no matter what their concerns are. So, I aim at building trust and using humour. Humour is a wonderful way of interacting with children. Take the anxiety that's causing the activities away. And I learned that in my classroom. Meet the child where they're at. Stop expecting them to come up to you, your levels of expectation. So ask the child what needs they need. How are they going to feel more settled? What will give them some security? And believe them. Actually think about what they're saying and believe them and work towards giving them what they need to help, because they'll know what helps them. Sometimes it's just, shift to somewhere else in the classroom. Build on their strengths. Always look at what their strengths are and see if you can manage to organise some activities around their strengths and change your expectations. When you change your expectations, then they will change. Keep in mind that FASD causes lifelong brain damage. It's not going to go away. They're not going to learn how to behave. They're not going to get better, but they can become far more settled with the right support and the right attitude.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Christine. So NOFASD does offer a variety of information, workshops, training and support for people that want to learn more about FASD. Can you tell us a bit more about these and how interested educators might be able to access them?
Yes, I'm very proud to say that NOFASD, which stands for the National Organisation of Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, is Australia's peak body for supporting people and families living with FASD. And we promote awareness and prevention, we help with diagnosis and improved outcomes. So we have a brilliant website. If you can have a look at our website, it's got all sorts of supports for resources for teachers. It's got checklists, it's got podcasts and blogs and webinars, all sorts of things, and certainly worth looking at as your sort of first call if you want some information and resources. We can always post out hard copies too. There's plenty of material there that you can get for supporting teachers. We also do training online, face-to-face for schools, for all sorts of groups. We work with the justice system, the health sector, and of course, education. We have a helpline that runs every day of the year, and we have all sorts of calls, often from teachers who just want to ask us a question about one of their students or find out more. And that's just free and available every day of the year. So please have a look on our website for the phone number, and please ring us anytime you have a question. And one of the things I do recommend is that we have, I think it's well over 1,000 teachers have already done the Australian Foundations in FASD course, which is an online course. I think it's 7 modules, quite easy, follow through, do it in your own time, and gives you a basic understanding of what FASD is. And the other thing that we do is we run support groups, families linking with families, which are very successful. And we have people all over Australia online regularly joining our 7-week families linking with family support groups. So always, if you have any queries about FASD, please contact NOFASD Australia, and we'll be more than happy to help you.
Thank you so much for highlighting all those wonderful resources that NOFASD provides. We really appreciate the work that you do in this space. Look, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, Christine. You have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. If you would like further information on FASD, please visit Learning with FASD at www.learningwithfasd.org.au.